Hey, Erev Tov, everyone. It's David Sidman here, editor with Breaking Israel News, and I'm here with my featured writer, Eliyahu Berkowitz. Say hello, Eliyahu, to everyone in Internet land.
Hi, everyone in Internet land.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about the deep state in Israel. Now, a lot of people don't realize that just like America has a deep state that is witch hunting Trump, Israel also has a deep state that is witch hunting Benjamin Netanyahu and other right-wing Knesset members. So this is something that it's nothing new. It's been happening for a while, but if the idea of the deep state is already a concept that people are understanding in America, we decided now is a good time to explain to you about the deep state that goes on here in Israel. So those of you who
Actually, before we go into that, I think we should talk about what we mean when we say the deep state.
Sure.
And according to Wikipedia, deep state is also known as a state within a state, a form of clandestine government made up of hidden or covert networks of power operating independently of a state's political leadership. That would mean someone who is not an elected official actually operating.
So, for example, if to give you an example, if you're in America, a guy like what's his name, Mueller, the head
Mueller,
of the FBI, Miller,
the Mueller report.
The Mueller report,
Yeah.
Right. So Mueller is often accused of being a deep state agent, which means there are a lot of people within the government in positions that are unelected and are basically untouchable. You cannot fire a lot of these people, especially in Israel.
Another better example of that in the American government, a lot of people are accusing Obama of running a deep state, exerting his influence after he's not in office anymore. One of the worst examples of that, the most blatant example, was when Trump was working towards dismantling the agreement with Iran over their nuclear program. John Kerry actually went to Europe and started meeting with European leaders to keep it together, because a lot of European leaders wanted to keep the agreement with Iran in order to maintain more than political, economic relationships. That it was questioned as to whether that was in violation of what's called the Logan Act. The Logan Act was enacted in 1799. It's a U.S. federal law that prohibits, it criminalizes negotiations by unauthorized persons with foreign governments. It's never ever been enacted or used against anyone, though.
Enforced.
Right, though it was pretty questionable with John Kerry.
So let's just get back to the topic of the deep state.
So these are deep state things. When
in a nutshell, the deep state is a shadow government. Someone within the government who makes decisions that might go against the interest of the elected leader or even the people. They might have foreign interests involved. There's a lot of theories that the deep state is a massive globalist network, meaning there are people who believe in no borders and they would like to bring down all borders, and they all work together as one unified socialist body in various Western countries. And that could be that's one theory. It might be true, it might not be, but one thing is for sure, that if every time there's elections in Israel, only right-wing politicians are suddenly recommended for indictments on the same exact charge, which is either breach of trust or fraud or accepting bribes, then you know that there are political forces within the police. And in fact, if you saw my investigative report that I published yesterday, it goes much deeper than that. It's often initiated by the media in Israel, who agrees to lionize people, high-ranking officials in the police, if they recommend indictments against specific politicians who are almost always to the right. So yesterday I wrote an expose about the fact that Bibi Netanyahu in the last elections, in the April elections, he was of course recommended to be indicted in March for breach of trust and for fraud.
Before you go on, those charges sound awful. However, if you look at what they actually are, the actual crimes or what he's accused of sounds pretty ridiculous. That's one of the interesting things.
Right.
Like,
One of them.
What exactly did he do?
Well, the terrible crime he did was that in his prime minister's residence, what happened was people would have bottles, plastic bottles. They would drink, let's say, spring water from plastic bottles. And Sarah Netanyahu, his wife, would go and recycle those bottles. And instead of giving the money that she got from recycling bottles back into the coffers of the government, she divvied it among her staff in her house. And on that, they actually recommended an indictment. Meanwhile, you got guys on the left like Ehud Barak, who he's receiving, millions of dollars from Jeffrey Epstein for studies and research papers that no one's ever seen, and it doesn't even the police don't even bat an eyelash.
Just to give you a more clear example, there was they were talking about the expenses of the prime minister's residence, and it was kind of embarrassing. I remember seeing a documentary where they actually visited Netanyahu and they were walking around his residence. There were tiles missing, and it wasn't so nice, to be honest. And Sarah Netanyahu was doing an interview, and
it was an embarrassment for people who thought he lived this lavish lifestyle from all these incredible gifts he was receiving.
I was embarrassed that my prime minister should live in a place like that. But in addition, they did an interview with Sarah Netanyahu, and she said, "Yeah, when you talk about our budget, it sounds huge to the average person. But meanwhile, at the very same time, Shimon Peres was the president, and he was going over budget. I think it was $30,000 a month.
I remember hearing somewhere that he spent something like 20 million shekels on a birthday party.
Yeah, on his birthday party, he brought in, what was her name?
He brought in Shakira.
No, not Shakira. She passed away, a black singer. Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
He brought in Whitney Houston.
Yeah.
And he was redecorating the presidential residence. And in Israel, the prime minister is higher than the president. And he was going over budget, I think, millions of shekels every month, and no one said boo.
And, they've been witch hunting Netanyahu. And by the way, just to be clear, I'm no Netanyahu fan. I'm not at all in his camp.
Me neither.
But when you got to call out a witch hunt, a political witch hunt, when you see one, especially when it comes from within the government. So, and it's essentially a coup, for lack of a better term. They've been publicizing that he's been receiving gifts. What kind of gifts has he been receiving?
Cigars.
Pistachio ice cream. I mean, and this thing has been making headlines. And to be honest, if you ask these, most Israelis are just like rolling their eyes every time a new indictment comes out against the prime minister. So,
and these sound awful. You can say he receives bribes. A cigar. That's the bribe. Sorry.
Which is interesting because they once interviewed Alan Dershowitz, and he said that when he met with Golda Meir, someone told him, "Don't meet Golda Meir unless you give her a carton of Lucky Strike cigarettes." Now, if he did the same thing to Netanyahu, they would have his behind. So it doesn't end with Netanyahu, by the way.
I want to say this is a parallel to what's going on in America. You can seriously throttle a political agenda by bringing spurious investigations, spurious charges. This is what America just went through with Mueller.
Yeah, for 2 years. For 2 years, the deep state has been convincing you that Donald Trump is involved in some crazy Russian collusion conspiracy, and poof, it all just blew up in their face, and there's no evidence, and there's absolutely nothing to go on, and
the same thing is happening in Israel.
Crazy. It's crazy.
The same thing is happening in Israel.
People like us in Israel who follow what's going on in America and to Trump and what's going on in Israel to Netanyahu are just taken aback by the similarities.
I should say, and this is something I want you to explain. Israel actually has, when you talk about deep state, Israel actually is worse than America when it comes to the legal system.
Yeah. So the deep state in Israel doesn't end with the police. The police are usually the executioners of the deep state's policies, but it doesn't necessarily begin and end with the police. The deep state is in the media, who usually initiates any sort of action. The deep state is within the education system, especially in the universities. The deep state is within the judicial system, who will almost always side with Arabs against settlers whenever there is a case brought before the Supreme Court. The deep state is also...
And how is the Supreme Court chosen? Unlike America, where it's actually pretty good, where there's a process where... And we saw this...
There's a public hearing.
There's a public hearing, goes before Congress. And this year it almost broke when Brett Kavanaugh was just... What they did to him has even some of the Democrats were like, this was horrendous. But in Israel it's even worse because it's already broken. The Supreme Court is self-appointing.
And it's not just self-appointing. We're talking about people from the extreme left. We're talking about heads of the New Israel Fund who were on the Supreme Court, and they're just promoting their friends. And they basically get away with things that Netanyahu could never get away with. For example, Esther Hayut, the current Supreme Court justice, it was revealed last year that she knew that a judge was offered a bribe and she didn't report it. And the media just gave her a pass. It was like they didn't even tweet about it. If Netanyahu did that, he would be in solitary confinement today. And it doesn't end there. There was this whole scandal where they realized that the head of the appointing committee of judges basically had female judges sleep their way into appointments, and the media ignored it. And the reason the media ignored it is because the media is all part of this deep state that works with elements in the police, elements even within the military. It's not as bad in the military, but it does exist in there. Elements within the state prosecutor's office, where the deep state is very strong, and I can explain to you in detail why. All these elements within the deep state that have their tentacles in just about every powerful government branch work together to shape the political landscape in Israel, even if it goes 180 degrees against what the public has decided and voted for.
One more aspect of or element of the deep state in Israel is this sounds so horrible. There is a division of the Shin Bet of the Shabak, the Israeli Secret Service. There's a division that is specifically tasked with operating
Jewish settler
right wing,
so-called terrorism.
That's all they do. I think in the past 10 years they've caught 6 guys, but they're full time. And
it's really, you're not even scratching the surface. There was an expose of Shin Bet guy in the for the Jewish division who actually married a woman in the settlement of Kiryat Arba. Did you hear about this?
No, but that's Avishai Raviv also.
Well, Avishai Raviv is a different story. He married a woman and had kids with her just to spy on settlers.
I think I know him.
And you have guys like Avishai, and it's not just that they try to catch Jewish terrorism. It's that they actually instigate it, so that they have and then after they instigate it, they bust these teenagers mostly who can't really, they don't have the wherewithal or the knowledge to defend themselves in Shin Bet. And Shin Bet is the Israeli security services. It's kind of like the FBI and the NSA all rolled into one. They arrest teenagers who obviously don't have the principles to stand up under these interrogations on trumped up
grill
charges.
them.
And
You
the
should
char-
know,
and
you should
everything's
know
and it's
Israel does not have habeas corpus. Okay, in America, if they bust you, they have to charge you. That's habeas corpus. It's the law. And if they don't charge you, they got to let you they got to let you go. In Israel, they have what's called administrative detention, which means they can bust you just because they want to and keep you as long as they want. And
when it comes to Jews, they do that, and often, and it's every other night in a outpost called Geulat Zion, where where these teenagers are just trying to build a house. The Shin Bet comes and they arrest them and they harass them and they destroy the home without any court order. Meanwhile, terrorists are roaming free. But let's get back for a second to the
that's can you imagine how much a deep state can operate if they don't have to charge people and they can arrest them and torture them, literally torture them,
and get away with it
with
scot-free.
impunity.
With complete impunity. That's a famous case of the Doom affair, where they tortured a kid into confessing. The media covered for them, the judicial system covered for them, and now that the case is actually being tried, it's completely falling apart, and it's not looking good for the prosecution.
Even the left-wing judges are going like, you guys really blew this one. If you'd like us to write about the Duma affair, it was something that was horribly misreported. There are things that are horribly misreported in Israel. In this, whatever. If you want us to tell you more about the Duma affair, write us a comment, and we'll be happy to go into that in depth.
All right, so let's get back to what's going on right now. There is the deep state has reared its ugly head because Israel is now going through another round of elections, in case you didn't know. So the latest victim of this round of elections is, well, there's a few. I reported yesterday that a guy named Gal Hirsch, he was someone who was supposed to be nominated by the then Interior Ministry to head the police. Now, this is the first time in Israeli history that someone from outside the police was going to be nominated to head the Israeli police. Well, the Israeli police didn't like that very much, so they sent a very clear message, and they filed trumped-up charges on him, including, of course, bribery and breach of trust and fraud. The wire fraud. The wire fraud part fell through, and now they're just trying him with bribery, if I'm not mistaken. Now, this is an investigation that's been going on for 4 years. This is an investigation that was opened in 2015 when they wanted to nominate him to head the police. It's been a 4-year investigation. Last week he joins the Likud. A couple days later, they suddenly decide to indict him. It's obviously not a coincidence. A 4-year investigation, and suddenly he joins Netanyahu's party and gets indicted. This is obviously has the fingerprints of the deep state all over it. Now,
keep in mind, what's crazy is even though Netanyahu has been prime minister longer than any other person has ever been in that position, he still can't get a handle. He still does not run the police or run the courts or even run the government. And that's the scary part.
It's not just that. If you read my expose that I entitled "The Deep State Claims Its Latest Victim," what happened is a news outlet called Mita interviewed a guy who used to be a top official in the Israeli Fraud Investigations Unit, and he told all. He said the police is run by extreme left-wing operatives. Not only that, at one time he closed the case against Lieberman when Lieberman was being tried for fraud when he wasn't, when he was still right-wing, and a senior officer in the frauds department got upset with him and said, "Great, look what you did. Now the labor isn't going to win." This is the police. They're trying, and he's saying that the police is completely run by extreme leftists, and not only that, the media has meetings with the police. They have meetings with the police to actually they tell the police, listen, if you try this specific politician, if you try this right-wing politician, we will put your name in the paper. We'll say what a great police officer you are, what hard work you did. And if you don't recommend an indictment against him, well, then you'll fall into the world of obscurity. So that's basically what they're up against. And the media plays a very strong role. They have closed door meetings with the police officers. This is all documented. This is not some conspiracy theory. So the latest victim, it appears, was Gal Hirsch. And now yesterday, the police recommended indicting Deputy Health Minister Litzman. Now, a political analyst who I often turn to, he was explaining to me that if a prime minister like Netanyahu gets an indictment, you can't fire him, but a minister you can fire. So Yaakov Litzman also, this was for something he did in public back in 2018. There was a woman who was supposed to be extradited for abusing children in Australia, I believe. Mm-hmm. And Litzman said she is not fit to stand trial, and he told members in his health ministry he tried to encourage them to do that. They didn't listen. It's not the most ethical, but it's certainly not a chargeable offense. It's at least not written down in any of the laws that you're not allowed to do that.
There are no hints that he took bribes for this or anything. It was just my impression was that it was something that he did out of belief.
And there was another incident where, and the other charge was actually for bribery because he had a friend who had a restaurant and the health department wanted to close it down, and he tried to convince him not to close it down, and they assumed that he took bribes because of it, even though there's no evidence. But I mean, we're talking about some restaurant in a Haredi community, and all of a sudden, the police care. These are not things that you need to indict people for. I mean, you can argue that they're unethical, but they're not necessarily indictable. But that doesn't matter, because as long as the police can discredit Litzman during the election season, it's going to weaken the chances of Netanyahu forming a coalition. Now, just as a quick aside, you might be saying to yourself, well, none of the Haredim who vote for him care if the police indict Litzman. The Haredim don't trust the police. The Haredim don't believe the police. In fact, if the police indict Litzman, it might actually buttress his position in the Haredim community, because the Haredim the Haredim aren't stupid. They know there's a deep state here.
It makes me admire Litzman even more, to be honest.
Right. So the Haredim know that. But here's the thing. This is going to strengthen Lieberman, because what Lieberman's going to do is Lieberman, who used to be right wing, now he's basically a turncoat, and according to my insider, he says that Lieberman is now working with the deep state. He's a made man. He cannot make his own decisions, no matter how right wing. He has to pretend to be right wing and
which is horrible, because Lieberman, the only reason he became anything in politics is because he attached himself to Netanyahu. Netanyahu brought him along and kept him with him,
Say something. I'll call it back in the frame. Don't worry, I'm coming to rescue you.
And now Lieberman is stabbing in the back. You have to understand, with a parliamentary government, the smaller parties, a coalition parliamentary government, the smaller parties have an inordinate amount of influence, which can be a very good thing, because you don't have any monolithic party, and it's like our way or the highway. But at the same time, you can have this guy Lieberman who, for not so nice reasons, can bring down the entire government and endanger the coalition.
So Litzman is now the latest sacrifice of the deep state, and he is now going to be indicted. And what's going to happen? Like I said, Lieberman is going to say, "See, you need me." Lieberman has been running a very anti-Haredi campaign. He's been running. He knows that a lot of Israelis are very sensitive about the ultra-Orthodox community, and they feel like the ultra-Orthodox community is trying to force their religion upon them. And Lieberman is trying to brand himself and position himself as kind of the savior of the secular Israelis who are hostile towards the ultra-Orthodox community. So what Lieberman's going to do now is he's going to use this episode and say, see, these Haredim are corrupt and they're trying to take positions of power. That's why you need me. And what that's going to do is going to mobilize the secular voters who are hostile to the Haredi ultra-Orthodox.
That's a very powerful point, that in Israel, much more than America, politics are divided along religious lines. Even geographically, the settlements are almost exclusively religious. When Gush Katif was destroyed, it was almost exclusively religious, and the non-religious people who lived in Gush Katif actually they got reparations from the government much more than the religious. So the Lieberman, yeah.
I didn't even know that.
They left early. The religious tended to wait till after the deadline and stand strong, and they got treated much better. The non-religious. Lieberman is both non-religious, though he is in theory right wing.
Well, here's the thing: he portrays himself as right wing. He lives in the settlements, but it's all a facade. He uses the fact that he lives in the settlements to try to convince people that he's right wing.
That's why I hesitated and didn't say he was right wing.
He talks tough against Israeli Arabs, so people think he's right wing. But the truth is, if you actually look at his policies, if it was up to him, he would give Fahim and practically all of the Jezreel Valley to a Palestinian state.
There's something you have to understand about Lieberman. You can't understand him because he's Russian. It's just an entirely different headspace, very different than Netanyahu, who actually grew up where I grew up in Philadelphia and Cheltenham.
So let's get back to so now I have an exclusive. I have some exclusive information that you guys are going to hear first. In the coming days, the Israeli police is planning on indicting none other than Likud member and former Transportation Ministry and current Foreign Minister Yisrael Katz.
No.
Yep. He's about to be indicted.
This is huge. This is really huge.
He's about to be indicted on breach of trust and fraud, and the bribery charge fell through. So Yisrael Katz is the next in line for the deep state's target practice.
Just to draw another parallel, this is very similar to all the shenanigans that happened in America just before the last elections, where Comey released this information about Hillary Clinton, and it's very similar to that, where people are it just shouldn't be. You should say, look, the elections are not a surprise. We have
the elections are. It doesn't. It's obvious, blatantly obvious, that every time there's elections, the police recommend indicting politicians from a very specific political party, from a very specific ideological stance, every single time and time again. And they're not even good at hiding it. They're not even good at pretending it. They're not even bothering to do damage
because they don't
control.
have to be.
Exactly. So that's in a nutshell.
The courts are not going to stop them.
That's just one small example of how the deep state has mustered up a coup against democratically elected so-called right-wing government in Israel. And now Eliyahu is going to...
Actually, before we do this, I want to suggest that perhaps the reason for this deep state had to do with the beginning of the country, Ben Gurion. When I was learning Israeli history, it was like Papa Ben Gurion. He was a sweet old man. I'm sorry, he was not. Ben Gurion did some very awful things, which are too long to go into right now. But the first Knesset was not elected. He appointed the first Knesset. He said, these are my people, I'm going to appoint them. So until Menachem Begin, who was elected in the 70s, there was only left-wing governments. In order to be an officer in the army, you had to sign on to the left-wing parties. I think Ariel Sharon was the first officer.
I mean, it was worse than that. If you were an immigrant from North Africa,
Oh yeah, it was also racist.
You had to join the Histadrut, which is
Right.
the workers' union, and send your kids to their schools. If you don't send your kids to their schools, you don't have work.
Right, and this had to do with Ben Gurion, who came out of European socialism. He was a power monger, and I think that headspace, that actually the framework was started then and is still continuing today, and they like to present themselves as the party of peace, but they're actually very bloody. So I think this has a historical basis.
Yeah, it definitely has roots in Israel's socialist beginnings. But when that happened, Israel was still, a huge miracle, and people largely overlooked it.
Yeah.
But since then, I think it's gotten much worse, because when Israel initially started, even though there was a very socialist government, it was much more free. Meaning the police weren't. The police didn't have the resources to witch hunt every single right-wing politician.
And the
they
rich
were too
pe- the-
busy trying to fend off
The
7
rich
Arab armies.
and the rich people in Israel were not that rich, and the poor people were not that poor. We all got by.
Everyone was poor, and no one was trying to take down the other because they had too many external enemies to deal with any sort of internal threats or perceived threats.
So I think the framework was started back then, and actually I think you're absolutely correct that it has gotten much worse, and this is the deep state that we see, and I think it's amazing how frequently these events parallel what's happening in America.
Why don't you give us kind of the biblical, prophetical? Is there anything going on here from a biblical point of view that we could kind of work with, or is this just kind of something that seems to be a trend worldwide? Maybe it is coordinated. Maybe there is some guy who is giving orders to Mueller saying, okay, when elections roll around, you start leaking stuff about Trump, and they're telling the deep state in Israel, when elections roll around, start leaking stuff about Netanyahu and start, getting the people to think that his entirely Likud party is a bunch of criminals by recommending indictments that never really materialize into anything.
I'm gonna say something a little bit extreme right now. Okay, I think when I was talking about Ben Gurion, I think the part of the problem, or a major aspect of the problem, is that Israel, it's not like other countries, not in its essence, not what it was intended to be, not where it comes from. We should be the icon of nationalism. So I think what we need to do is we need to be nationalists, which means we need to have a king. And when we return the dynasty of the Davidic dynasty, a lot of these issues will be worked out. Rather than have a court system, because the Israeli court system is based on the British court system, which was horrible to the Jews and Israel, we need a Sanhedrin. We need a king from the Davidic dynasty. We need a return to the essence of Israel, and it was prophesied that this is what will happen, and I think what we're seeing now is the need for it. I had a British friend, and he said the parliament is the most common form of government, but it only really works when it's paired with a monarch.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that. I think democracy is an interesting thing. I'm not so sure it's the ideal, or it's not the ideal by itself. But I think a lot of this needs to be worked out with a monarch.
Certainly not a Jewish ideal.
It is certainly not a Jewish ideal. I mean, the ideal is to have a kingdom of God, and
we don't get to vote on the mitzvot.
No, we don't get to vote on what we think. We don't get to change God's word.
Yeah.
And I think
And I think that's where things start to fall apart, and that's what I think a lot of the deep state aims to do. Is the deep state's biggest enemy isn't Netanyahu. The deep state and socialists' biggest enemy are God-fearing Jews who believe that Israel is a nation and not some religion. Why? Because the threat of an independent nation with borders, it decimates their worldview.
That's another thing. When you talk about what a nation is, you talk about language, culture,
shared history,
even cultural things, food, these dress. These are things that are mandated by God when it comes to Israel, and the ruler of the country as well.
And I'd like to say that with all those things we said, shared history, culture, language, I would also like to add a national monument. And our national monument as the nation of Israel needs to be the third temple.
Big time.
And the biggest enemy of the deep state and those who want open borders and those who want one world order are the God-fearing Jews who want to scream from the rooftops that we are an independent nation who serves no one but God, and we want to do this by building our nation's monument, which is the third temple, is precisely what this generation needs and precisely what's threatening the deep state.
And it's a universal need. It's not just a need for Israel. As I said, these things are parallel. You see the same things happening in America as are happening in Israel. I remember not so long after suicide bombers started in Israel, you had 911.
I believe that we Jews in Israel, need to lead this thing.
Yes.
I believe that we need to be we need to lead
for the
this
good
thing.
of the whole world.
That's one beef I have with Netanyahu, is he always seems to be waiting for America to attack Iran, America to give us approval to build in Judea and Samaria, America to recognize that the Golan belongs to Israel. He's always waiting for their approval. I believe that Israelis living in Israel and the Jews in general need to make a 180-degree switch and realize we need to start leading this thing. Because as it says, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, which means from Jerusalem, the Torah, the scriptures, the Tanakh, the prophecies are initially released from Jerusalem. And as the Jewish nation who's coming back to Jerusalem...
And that's not a religious thing. That's also a national thing. Nations, the 70 nations are mandated by God to the entire world. And they need to, each nation has to take its role.
I believe it needs to come from us.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good place to end it.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Great. And I have one announcement. Coming soon, I just came from a conference. I'm going to be reporting it. I'm not allowed to release it yet, but I can tell you, I was looking at an entire 250-page report given over by a professor. They actually ran the first actual test run of the red heifer. And if you hear it from someone else, you're not hearing the truth. Breaking Israel News is going to be the absolute first and perhaps the only English media that is directly connected to the rabbis and the professors and the people who did this. But they actually did research on which woods to burn, and then they actually built what's called a marechet, a bonfire, several meters tall, and put a baby cow on it. Not a baby.
Don't give too much away.
And burned it. And they figured out how much ashes it would give and how many people could be purified by those ashes. The numbers are astounding. So I'm very excited about this.
Give them a little...
that was a little taste. There is so much
teaser.
more to this.
Guys, I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as we enjoyed presenting it to you. And if you know other people who you think deserve to hear the truth about what's going on in Israel and how we Jews in Israel see ourselves as those who need to lead by building the third temple, please feel free to share this with them, because what we're saying is extremely important information that you will not hear anywhere else, and it's the type of insight that can give you the understanding and the wisdom to empathize with our struggle. So please share this, subscribe to this channel. If there's any topics you want us to discuss, let us know in the comments. Let us know in the comments what you thought about this video, and we look forward to hearing your feedback.
And go to breakingisraelnews.com. You can subscribe there. And also in the comments, please tell us what you'd like to hear more about. Google and all the algorithms do work against us, so please subscribe.
Yeah.
They
Give
do.
us the thumbs up.
We're religious, we're right wing. Sorry, we're Israel. They don't like us.
All right, that's all for now. Erev Tov from here in Efrat, Judea.